Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Biggest Mistakes Rolling Out Microsoft Teams, featuring our special guest, David Broussard. My name is Patrick, and I'm a sales manager here at SysKit. And today we are joined by David, our star of the day, and my colleague Zlatko, who will later be showing you a demo of SysKit Point. Many of you already know us as a company, but for those who don't, let me briefly introduce us. SysKit is a software development company founded more than 13 years ago. We develop products for Microsoft 365 governance and security, as well for SharePoint on-premise administration. We currently have more than 3,000 customers around the world, ranging from small businesses to large corporations with hundreds of thousands of employees. We currently offer 4 products, including our award-winning SP.Doc Kit for SharePoint on-premise documentation, as well as SysKit Point for Microsoft 365 governance that we will be demonstrating today. Before we start, just a few housekeeping items. All registrants will receive a recording of the webinar within a few days. After David's presentations, we will have a short demo of the SysKit Point platform showing how it can help you gain complete visibility of your workspaces and users, as well as easily fix any and prevent sprawl. After that, we will have a Q&A session where David will answer any questions you may have. Please use the Q&A function on the right side of your screen to ask any questions throughout the webinar. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest today. David Broussard is the Director of Digital Workplace Solutions at Quisitive. He helps organizations find the best way to use technologies to achieve their business goals. David has been in IT for over 30 years and got into SharePoint in 2003. He focuses on the M365 stack while productivity is still his first love. David is also a frequent speaker at industry conferences such as Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. And I will now give a warm welcome and turn things over to David. David, are you ready?
I am ready to go. Thank you very much for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it. All right, let's hope we've got the right window being shared here. All right, excellent. So today, and welcome everybody to the webinar. I really appreciate you guys being here. We're going to talk about something that everybody really is thinking about. You know, we've rolled out Teams. Teams is the #1 communication collaboration platform out there. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of mistakes in rolling it out, and so we're going to kind of go over some of those mistakes and see if we can talk about, first of all, how did they show up, and how do we get rid of them? So just a couple of quick things. I had a great introduction. I really appreciate that. Just a couple of things about me. You can follow me on Twitter at dbroussard, on Facebook at dbroussard, LinkedIn and dbroussard. Try to keep that nice and consistent. My co-host and I just started back up releasing some episodes of the Cloud Whisperers podcast, and so you can tune in there on any of your favorite podcasting platforms to hear about that. But enough about me. Let's talk about Teams, and I want to start by talking about how it got so messy in the first place. How did we allow this? I mean, for those who've been around, we mentioned earlier, I've been working with SharePoint since 2003. I have seen lots and lots of SharePoint instances go awry, both on-premise and in the cloud, where we get an explosion of sites and everything gets confusing. And governance became the watchword of the day, talking about governance and making sure that we were going to do governance right. And then Microsoft comes along and they release Microsoft Teams. And Teams is really cool, built on top of SharePoint, right? We've got that whole SharePoint structure underneath it. We've got communications, we've got persistent chat, all of this cool stuff. And almost every organization I worked with kind of said, you know what? Yeah, we're going to be very careful about this. We're going to be very slow in how we adopt Microsoft Teams. And then something happened, of course, right? We had the explosion of Microsoft Teams in large part because of the pandemic, right? So because of that pandemic, we actually, went out there and we saw growth that I know Microsoft did not expect was going to happen. Microsoft launched Teams around 2016, and by 2019, they had kind of they were motoring along with about 20 million people who were using Teams on a daily basis. And Microsoft said, we can do better than that, but we know we're going to grow this. It's going to continue to grow. However, in 2020, Microsoft saw a growth in Teams utilization from March to June of almost 900%, right? And that it's in a ways, it's a testament to the architecture that Microsoft had behind the scenes, that it allowed for such rapid growth and the system didn't just crater, right? But that 20 million users by the end of 2020 had more than doubled to 45 million users a day. And by the end of 2020, really about the later half of 2020, we were up to 270 million daily users in Microsoft Teams. There's a great graph I saw one time that shows, Slack and Teams, and they're pretty even to each other. By 2019, Microsoft was a little bit ahead of them, and then Teams just takes off. It just rockets into the stratosphere. My favorite stat, and Microsoft released this back in 2020, was saying from the single day March 12th in 2020, daily meeting minutes, so how many minutes people were in meetings in Teams in a day, was about 500 million. By March 31st, this had climbed more than 500% to 2.7 billion minutes, right? So I had a boss that said adoption of Teams is no longer an issue, but now we're going to have a governance problem that's going to be approaching us. And so to that end, we do have certain problems with explosive growth. And I kind of put them in 4 categories. There's the features that are part of Microsoft Teams and the M365 platform. They're a problem because for those of us who have been in Microsoft 365 for a long time, we recognize this stuff is coming constantly. There are new features being dropped constantly, and Microsoft has a tendency to push them out there without actually, they tell you, right? But if you're not following the messaging center, you might not notice it, and they come turned on usually. So it's an opt-out as opposed to an opt-in, and that can be a problem. Guest and external use became a big issue because people suddenly were having to figure out, well, how do I collaborate with people who aren't maybe inside my company? And how do I have meetings with them? How do I share files with them? How do we collaborate? And, by default, a lot of that stuff's turned on. We had issues around hierarchy, right? And what I mean by that is the question was, how did we go out and create Teams workspaces, which are kind of the central point of Microsoft Teams? And almost every organization, went out and said, well, I'll just build a team based on my organizational structure, my org chart. And then, of course, we also have a governance and lifestyle issue, a life cycle issue. And you could take all of these things and call it governance if you want to, and that's actually true. But what I'm meaning here is the fact that when Teams was launched with this explosive growth, governance took a back seat. And organizations just said, we'll figure out how to control it later. For now, let's just get this thing out there and get it working. So let's dive a little deeper into those specific issues and the like. So, some things that kind of threw people for a loop was that if you turn on Teams inside your organization, or actually if you just turn on your tenant, right? Teams is there, and everybody in the organization can create teams. And a lot of people find that very scary, especially when they think about sprawl and going, I've got all these teams that are going to get created, and I can't have that. And there are ways of dealing with that, like turning it off, allowing only certain users to create them using an Active Directory group. There's a lot of ways we can control that, but by default, it wasn't controlled. And a lot of IT managers didn't necessarily know that was happening. Another thing people didn't think about was the fact that, persistent chat means that our chats are persistent, right? They don't go away. They are, in fact, retained forever by default. So unless somebody manually deletes them, unless you do something special, they're going to be retained. When private channels launched, those came out enabled. And private channels, there's nothing wrong with them. They serve a purpose, but they also create more site collections, which can increase the burden on top of our people who are maintaining, our SharePoint administrators who are maintaining things. Obviously, external sharing is another thing that if you didn't have it turned off, Microsoft likes to launch it with the most permissive and collaborative environment possible, and that can mean that people could be taking documents and sharing them externally when you don't want that to happen or are prohibited by rule or regulation from that happening. Another area that's actually a big concern is the concept of apps. So one of the really cool things about Microsoft Teams is inside of a channel, inside of Teams, I can add apps. Now those apps could be from Microsoft, right? An example of that might be like Shifts, right, is an app that Microsoft provides. There's a whole bunch of Microsoft apps, about 60 of them. There's also custom apps on the other end, apps that your organization builds and deploys. So allowing Microsoft apps and custom apps, you might be relatively okay with allowing those things happening. But what about third-party apps? Well, third-party apps are powerful, and one of the things that made Slack really useful was all of the third-party plugins that were available. And so Microsoft said, well, great, we can have lots of third-party plugins as well. And there are hundreds of them. Last I checked, it was over 600, okay? But those third-party apps, while Microsoft is going to guarantee, for example, that your data will be stored and transmitted only inside their network and encrypted at rest, encrypted in transit, and all those wonderful things, that's not necessarily true of a third-party app, and you have to be very careful about that. It's also true that third-party apps can require additional subscriptions, and they can store your data inside of them, depending upon the app we're talking about. And that may or may not be a problem. If it's an integration with ServiceNow, well, you've already bought ServiceNow and you're using ServiceNow, and you probably have it already configured. But if somebody comes along and says, "Ooh, I think I'll start using this other app," and you have no idea what it is, it could be set up in a situation where that app could be a security or compliance issue for you. Okay. That ability to edit and delete conversations and posts, some organizations find that problematic because once something has been said, I need to make sure I keep a copy of it. So retaining and deleting posts is going to be an issue. And then, at the end, when we think about meetings, allowing anonymous users into meetings, on the first blush, that sounds like that might be bad, but at the same time, if somebody's going to join and they don't have a Microsoft 365 account, right, or they don't have a Microsoft account now, it used to be just had an M365 account, then you have to let them in anonymously. And then lastly, we think about, I love webinars inside of Teams. I love live events inside of Teams, and there's more functionality coming into that every day. But do you really want everybody in your organization being able to go out and do that stuff? So as you can see, these are some things that are turned on by default. And if we don't turn them off, they're not necessarily going to cause problems, but they could. So let's take a look at the next one on the list, which is guests and external users. This is a place where a lot of organizations get spun around the axle, especially around external users. So when we talk about external users in the Teams concept, what we're talking about is who can you IM, call, and share desktops with inside of the Teams context, right? So if you think back to the Skype for Business days, I could Skype for Business with other federated organizations. I could even Skype from my Skype for Business, say with people who are running Skype commercial, right? And the same thing is true, we can control inside of Teams. External users, we can say, you know what, I'm going to have an allow domain list, or I'm going to have a list of domains that are blocked that you're not going to be able to communicate with, but you can communicate with other people. I can also say, what about unmanaged accounts, right? So these people who have an account, but they're not part of an Azure Active Directory, so that we can't get good verification of who they are. These Microsoft accounts or personal accounts, right? Are we going to allow them to be involved in chat? And can somebody in Skype commercial still chat with our users, and can we chat with them? Those are concerns we've seen people have. A lot of times organizations didn't realize these things were turned on, and it could cause some problems. Now, guest and shared users are different. Guest users are people who are outside your organization who are invited in and can then access Microsoft Teams. They usually have to run the Teams client, switch to your tenant. Now they can see Teams inside your tenant. They can IM with people inside your tenant. They can collaborate on files and conversations inside of your tenant. And once again, by default, that was turned on. A lot of organizations turn it off, which you can do, but there's actually a better solution, which is that you can use sensitivity labels to control that at an individual team level. So you can say, look, by default, teams aren't allowed to have external users, but under certain circumstances, I can apply a sensitivity label that will enable that external access that we can turn on and off. Okay. And then lastly, this concept of shared users. Now, this is relatively new. Microsoft rolled out the concept of shared channels in 22. And what this allows you to do is set it up so that I can go to an individual channel and I can share it with somebody outside my organization. And they will be able to see the channel and its files, but they kind of see it as more like a chat. They don't see the entire team. They're just able to see that one channel. Okay, and it's important to remember that you have to create a channel to be shared. So you can't take an existing channel and share it. You have to actually create a brand new channel to enable the sharing to take place. Okay, but once again, these things are turned on. As they start releasing, if you're not on top of them, it can cause some issues. So thinking about what you want to do with guests and external users is important. And the answer is not usually just don't just turn it all off, because that ability to collaborate both inside and outside your organization is really what makes teams so valuable. So the next item on the list is the hierarchy concept. And what I've really seen a lot of organizations do is go out and just create a team for every department or manager or location. You know, I'm down near San Antonio, Texas, so maybe my organization creates a San Antonio team. We have an office in Austin, so maybe they create an Austin team. I report to a specific manager, so they create the manager gets a team and all of his employees are added automatically. Or maybe we go to a department like the modern work department or the infrastructure department inside of my organization, and all the people are added to those teams. And the theory is, well, this is where you work, right? This is your manager, this is your location, that's where you should collaborate. And some organizations even go so far as to use dynamic groups. So we can say, well, look, I know who your manager is, so I'm going to create a group called, you know, Manager X, and everybody who has Manager X as their reports to, I'm going to automatically add them to that dynamic group, and I won't have to maintain it. If we move you to a different manager, great, you're going to automatically switch and all of that. And that seems like it makes a lot of sense, but it does miss the fundamental nature of how Teams is intended to be used. And that is really to solve process issues. So I like to call Teams an ad hoc solution. So we have personal collaboration and we have enterprise collaboration. Personal collaboration is OneDrive, email, things like that. Enterprise collaboration is traditionally SharePoint. We've got a top-down taxonomy and a hierarchy and search. Everything's firmly controlled on one side and lightly controlled on the other. But in the middle is this concept of ad hoc. And ad hoc is where I've got a group of people, let's say the project team, working on a specific set of tasks, say the scope of the project, for a specific period of time, the life of the project, right? And if we create our teams around that functional process, they're going to not be all part of a manager, a location, a department. Usually we're bringing these together in an ad hoc manner, and they can cross departments, cross managers, and that's a great way to get people back together. Okay, and this gets to the point that teams are very easy to create. All somebody's got to do is go and click on the button that says create a brand new team, and they become the owner of that team, which means, by the way, they are an owner of the site collection behind the scenes and have full control over that site collection. So you better train people about what it means to be a team owner before you let them go. And this is because they are adding users, right, to their teams when they need them. The problem is, and that can be external people as well, the problem is, are they ever getting rid of them? So if I add, say, Tim to my team, because Tim's working on the project for a little while, when Tim's done, and especially if Tim is an external resource, right, somebody's got to go back and remove Tim from the system. Okay, and that's something that a lot of people don't do. The other problem with it is that because teams are created on and very easy to create, a lot of times people go straight to creating a brand new team, not realizing that a team may already exist to solve that problem. And this whole concept of external users, that's really the one of the scary points of this, right? When I add an external user, they are becoming a guest user in my Azure AD, but are we really monitoring what they're doing going forward. So those are all some other problems that happened when we grew exponentially. And this really comes into enforcing governance and lifecycle, right? So we delayed governance because we said, you know what, we got to get everybody working from home. We got to do all that stuff. And then, you know what, we never got the time a lot of times to go back and put some order to our team's implementation. And we also looked at it and said, wow, this is hard. I mean, now I've got 500 teams, I've got 5,000 teams, whatever that number happens to be, even if it's 50 teams, right? You're going, man, I've still got a full plate. I don't have time to step out and do this stuff. So how do you go out and do that? And you know, by default, teams have to be manually deleted. Now, it's true, you could go into Azure AD and you can create a policy that goes out and deletes Microsoft 365 groups, which will kill the team as well, but that's not set up by default. And it's also kind of a hammer approach to these kinds of nails, not necessarily the correct in every instance, okay? So we got ourselves in a situation where everything is crazy. So how do we come up with a formula to go ahead and rein in the teams that we see out there? Okay, so let's talk about our formula. And this is not rocket science, right? But we do have to practice it. And I will also warn you up front that anytime you start trying to bring control to something like Microsoft Teams, this is not a one and done. This is not a project that you run and then you're finished with it. This is something that you're going to have to do over and over and over again. It really is something that is a constant state of affairs, okay? And so the most important thing you've got to understand is you've got to inventory your tenant. You've really got to understand what's out there. Okay, and we'll talk more about these in detail in a second, but let me go over all of them first. But think about why that's important. If you don't know what's out there, right, then it's really difficult for you to start to develop a plan for what you need to do. So getting that inventory is going to be important. Then we have to talk about what are our security and compliance requirements? Are we under GDPR? Do we have HIPAA? Do we have to do FedRAMP moderate? Do we have to do FISMA or any of these other kinds of, are we looking for ISO 27001 or NIST 800-53? Whatever that compliance requirement is, or what our overarching security requirements are, we have to understand what those requirements are, and then, and this is the fun part, we have to map those requirements into the settings that we have inside of Microsoft Teams. Some of the solutions of that, we can actually flip a bit and make things be compliant. But when we do so, we may be removing functionality from people that we're going to be concerned about. So there's a balancing act here of deciding how much of this am I going to control using settings, and how much of this am I going to control via policy and training. Okay. The next thing that you want to do, if you're going to rein in your rampant tenant, you need to make sure that you're using Teams in such a way that it aligns with your business goals, okay? Now, you think, why is that important? Well, it's important because if we're not using Teams in a way that actually makes us more productive as an organization, that makes us more successful as an organization, then, really, are we getting advantage out of Teams, or is Teams becoming another place that information goes to die, right? And so for my money, the way I would suggest handling that is to design your Teams solutions, and don't think of Teams like you thought of Outlook. Outlook is something that everybody had. We read our emails, we scheduled our meetings, right? Teams is starting to be seen that same way. I am people. I can have meetings inside of Teams. Yeah, maybe I got a few teams here and there, but I don't really, I just go to my department team, and it's not all that useful. It's more useful to IM and to have meetings. But when we start actually designing solutions and thinking of Teams as an application delivery platform, that is actually going to do more towards reining in our rampant tenant, because what's going to happen is we're going to guide people into the appropriate ways to go and use Teams. And what you're going to discover is I had 5,000 teams before I started. I got rid of a bunch of teams that were test teams and not being used anymore. But now suddenly I look back and I have 10,000 teams. And I go, wait a minute, how did I reduce and rein in my tenant and have more? Well, if those new teams have a purpose, have a life cycle, have a plan for their existence, and a plan for when they're going to go away, suddenly I'm not as concerned about the fact that I have more and more of these teams. Okay, so let's dive into some of these things. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick video, and I'm going to show you this video just because it's fairly straightforward, but it's talking about how do you get an inventory of all of the stuff that's out there. Now, you could go to the Teams administration console and do this, but you could also go out and get, remember, every team has a group, and you can go to your SharePoint administration console and export all of these sites out into a CSV file. And if all you're trying to do is to get a snapshot of where you are, this works fine. Okay, I can take this, I can turn it into a table. Once it's in a table and I tell it I've got headers, I can go through now and say, hey, you know what? I want you to show me everything where I have a certain template, like a team site, right? Which is meaning a Microsoft 365 group. And that makes it very easy for me to go ahead and work with this. And so if I save this as an XLSX, right? This is another thing that I've actually done a number of times. I'll take this file that I've got, I've got all my things, and now I can go to a SharePoint site and I can actually create a brand new list, right? And say, I want to create a brand new list. And instead of creating it manually, I create it from my Excel file. Okay, so now what I can do is go out and grab that export file, right? Open it up, and then it's going to say, hey, look at all these different areas. I do need to fix a few things, like, you know, you'll notice, like, for example, it thinks that Booleans are actually numbers, but it calls them true and false, and so it'll blow up when you try to actually implement it. Dates it thinks are numbers, you got to change those to dates and stuff like that. There's just a few little minor things like that as you go through that you've got to go through and make sure are fixed. And then once you've done that, and I think I've got them all there, you can go ahead and import this, give it a realistic name. I'll call this DCB site list, I think, and then go ahead and create it. Now, it will then import this entire list and bring it in, okay? Just fair warning, I sped this part of the video up, right? Because it takes a while for that to happen. But now suddenly I've got a SharePoint list, which means I can now work through and do all the fun SharePoint things like sorting and views and, oh, maybe building a Power Automate on top of it. And the purpose here is to go through and kind of show my ability to go through and look at everything that is a Microsoft 365 group. But this gives me a way of going out and looking at it. Now, the downside to this, right? The downside is this is a snapshot once, right? If I want to do this multiple times, that means I'm going to have to go through and manually run this process and load it again. I could instead do it with PowerShell. There's a couple PowerShell scripts out there that you could use to do this, or, and this is probably the best bet, to be honest with you, is use a third-party tool to handle this kind of stuff for you and to give you reporting on those lists that are out there. All right. What about the security and compliance settings? So the first thing that I always recommend doing is going out to your current system and documenting all of the settings so that you know what your current site is set up to look like. Okay, and this can be done. I've done this in the past in an Excel workbook. There are some scripts, once again, out there that you can go out and get. There's one on GitHub, and I've forgotten the name of it right now, but Microsoft started and is supporting a community-driven ability to go out and actually pull all of the settings from a tenant. I think they call it a DSC, desired state configurator script, right? But you can run it and pull all of the settings out of a system, your SharePoint settings, your tenant settings, sensitivity and compliance and retention labels, and also all your team settings, right? And that will let you know what's actually going on inside of your tenant. You have to do that first. The next thing you've got to do is you really do have to decide what are your security requirements? What are your compliance requirements? And be able to go through these different areas and decide, hey, do I need to change any of these settings? And if I do, I need to make that change, document someplace that I made that change and why, right? And then here's the fun part. you're not done. Just because we make all the changes and we implement these security requirements, right? And by the way, you're not going to do it all at once. You're going to prioritize things and build on this process. And by the way, sometimes that means you're going to pull features back from people. Like you may turn off external sharing at the tenant level, but you should make sure that when you do that, recognize to find out who's using external sharing, right? And make sure that they've got an alternate path until you can turn it back on for their locations. And maybe that becomes something that you do on a location by location basis. This, by the way, I recommend looking into sensitivity labels, right, that can turn that on and off at the group level. But recognize that you're going to be rinsing and repeating this on a regular basis. And the last thing I'll tell you is remember to be on the lookout. And what I mean by that is, as I said before, and if you ever go out to the Office 365 roadmap, you will see that there are hundreds of items that Microsoft is currently working on and getting ready to deploy out to Microsoft 365. And when you look at all that stuff coming out, that can be new security settings, that can be new retention settings, that can be new compliance settings, new features and functionality, and all of these things you need to be on top of. So if you aren't looking at that roadmap, or at least somebody in your organization is looking at the message center to find out what is coming, that's something that you can start doing. And that's going to be so if you talk about a big mistake, right, not knowing that new things are coming, because unlike in the on-premise world where we could just choose not to put an update out there, or not to install a service pack, or not to upgrade, we don't have that option in the cloud. And frankly, we're all better for it because we're getting new features and functionality so much quicker, okay? All right, so the next one on the list is we need to align with our business goals. And how do we do that? Well, first of all, we do have to define our goals. And there's a lot of ways that you can go around defining your goals. Now, to a certain extent, almost every organization I've ever worked for, at the beginning of their fiscal year or the calendar year, if they're aligned on calendar, the management goes out there and explains, hey, this is where we are in our organization. This is what we're trying to accomplish this year. And sometimes, those goals are more culture oriented, but a lot of times if you dig beneath them, you're going to find that there's a level beneath those goals and a level beneath those that go all the way down to defining, hey, if we're going to be more competitive in this area and try to make more money in this area, we need to have a better system for handling this process inside of our organization. So we want to brainstorm and go out and find out what a bunch of goals are, right? And then we want to sit down and this is not something that you want to do by yourself. This is something that really the business and IT have to do in concert with each other. And you may be doing this to a large extent inside your organization today to define large IT projects. But remember that a lot of times, once we've rolled M365 out, we kind of think we're done with that part of the IT project, and we're not. Because what we do inside of teams, if you let it happen all organically, then your alignment and your efficiency is not going to be as good as it could be. So if we meet on a regular basis and talk to our business people and our business analysts and get them to talk about what's important to you and why is it important to you from a business standpoint, we on the IT side can sit there and say, aha, I see that you're trying to accomplish this task right here, but what if we could automate this process and make it more efficient for you? And because it's a collaborative process that also involves communications and is spread out across the entire organization, man, that sounds like a team solution right there, right? And I can bring in reports and I can bring in files and I can bring in all kinds of things to make it easier for people to actually get their jobs done, right? We are going to measure impact and difficulty to implement, right? And that go all together is and mapping our technology then allows us to create a roadmap of what we want to do over the next, say, 3, 6, 12 months, right? I don't usually go more than about 12 months because business things change so quickly out there that it's probably not worthwhile. I may have some high ideas of what I want to do after a year, but mostly I want to focus in on what do I want to do for the next 6 to 12 months and build a roadmap around that. And by the way, tie that roadmap back to the business goals that were articulated in the brainstorming exercise. So when you go back and say, hey, we're going to do this effort, right? And somebody says, yeah, isn't that's going to be very disruptive? It's going to cost some money. You say, but yes, but this is tied back to achieving this corporate goal. This is going to enable us to achieve these tangible benefits, okay? And by the way, to start with, the ideal opportunity here is to go after measurable problems, because if you can measure how effective you are, for example, let's say you have something like contract origination, right? And that contract origination currently takes 60 to 90 days from the time somebody writes up the contract to have something done till it can actually be sent out and finalized and is ready to go. I've seen orgs that can take even longer than 90 days because it's got to go a lot of different directions. There's a lot of collaboration, a whole bunch of email going back and forth. What if we pulled all that inside of Teams? Maybe use some Power Automate, maybe use some approval workflows, but maybe use some co-authoring, right? And then finally end up with maybe some Adobe Sign or DocuSign electronic signatures of this, both internal and external. We can greatly streamline that process and take that 90-day time frame and maybe shorten it down to say something like 30. And that makes us more efficient as an organization. So but here's why I say do it that way. If you can find something where you can actually change a visible number that's a pain point and you can show success, it gives you ammunition when you're going into something that you can't necessarily have a tangible number around, or it's not easy to measure the efficiency of something, okay? So highlight those tangible, measurable successes, right? And that enables you to go after the ones that are still important, but maybe not as easily measured. Okay, so what about solving functional problems with teams? And this is the last thing I talked about in there, right? Which is, how do we solve a functional problem with teams? And so I'll give you an example here. This concept of employee onboarding, right? Employee onboarding has been around for a long time. It is something that a lot of organizations have struggled with for years. And you say, well, how could I use Microsoft Teams to actually make this go easier, right? And the answer is, well, we've seen this used before. What if you create a team workspace for each new employee? And you go, wait. So every new employee is going to get their own private Teams workspace? And my answer is, well, yes. Yeah, it gives them a place to have contact with the people who are onboarding them, their manager, for example, the accounting people that are going to be setting up in the system, HR and benefits, marketing, all the different individuals that are going to be coming in there and actually working with them. Is a place where they can go in and have all of them and be able to communicate with them. Yeah, I can have different channels to direct them to different places, but make sure they understand when they're onboarded that this is a place that there are no silly questions, right? If you're not getting something, if something is confusing, this is a safe place to ask those questions and be able to go ahead and get answers from the people who are going to know. And by the way, kind of recommend maybe having something like a day one channel, right, with all of their onboarding documents inside of that. And so I'll show you what I'm talking about. This is just a quick example in a demo tenant that I've got of an example of what this might look like. So I have David Broussard, new employee, right? It's got a general channel, sure, and I'd probably have a bunch of files inside of that. I've got an accounting channel. I can talk to accounting. I've got a day one channel, and you can see inside of there, I could have like a folder. If it ever decides to come up, there we go, a folder with all my day one forms. Or I could go into the facilities area because I might need to fill out, as an example, I might need to fill out an access card request form, right? I need to go out and fill that Word document out. And instead of me having to then send it someplace, right, I can simply mention my facilities contact, right, in the facilities channel and let them know, hey, I filled out these forms, and now they can go grab them. Or I could do something like a Power Automate that when I'm done, moves them to the appropriate location. However you want to go ahead and do something like that. But this is a nice interim step where we can kind of figure out, hey, what are those things going to look like as we move forward, so that at the same time, we're gathering the information, but we haven't over-automated a system to start with. All I've done at this point is created a Teams template, right? And then when a new employee comes in, they get provisioned. right? And I can invite them in, and they can, even before day one, be able to come inside, ask questions, get paperwork finished, and hit the ground running. And this then becomes they could delete it whenever they're done with it, right? But they can also keep it around, and they can keep it around and use it for lots of other purposes. It's a great teaching tool for Microsoft Teams, and how they use it, and it gives them a place where they can say, okay, if I need to talk to my manager, if I need to talk to accounting, if I need to share certain things, this is a place where I can go and do that. Okay, so that's just an example of how a solution like that might look. There's other ones. I'd mentioned vendor or contract approval, loan origination is another thing I've seen, and there's dozens more opportunities, because so much of what we do in organizations is tied to collaboration and communication happening at the same time. And with that, I'm going to step into the last section of this, which is our lessons from the field. Okay. And so these are things that I have run across in my years now. I know it seems like Teams just launched like yesterday, but in reality, it's been around for a long time. I mean, heck, we're in 2023 now, and that's almost 4 years after Microsoft reported their 2019 numbers. So. And we've seen explosive growth. Over 1 million organizations are using Teams across the world. But there's a lot of things people have done wrong. So one of the big ones that I always tell people is don't turn off critical features to Teams. And when I talk about critical features of Teams, I have had people who've said, I want to create a team, but I don't want them to be able to post to it. I just want them to be able to read, and I don't want them responding to it either, right? And you're like, well, okay, the purpose of a team is to have, it's not a news feed. If you want that, build an intranet, right? This is a place for people to have conversations where people are able to collaborate. Doesn't mean you can't create org-wide teams. I've seen people do that as well. And org-wide teams have got their purposes. They become a great place to have communications inside the organization, right? But I had another customer one time that actually wanted to go out and they wanted to roll out Teams, but they wanted to use workspaces as well as chats, which I thought was great. But they didn't want anybody storing any files in Teams. So we had to go and turn off OneDrive and turn off SharePoint and not let anybody upload any files. And I will tell you, we did it, it worked. It was a terrible user interface for the end users, and the Teams pilot went very poorly as a result of that. So I don't do that. I mean, it's just a bad idea. Another one I've seen is that org-wide team, right? Where they say, well, we're just going to create one org-wide team, and then we'll just create channels, and we'll create a channel for each department or a channel for each group inside the organization, and we'll just let them all work inside of that. And we'll even create like private channels so that accounting can be private and general counsel can be private, but we're still just going to be part of one big team. And that's another path that leads to confusion, and it really doesn't align with how Teams is really very valuable in that ad hoc workspace. Now, I'm a big believer in not turning off Teams creation, or if you do turn it off, it's because you're replacing it with some kind of tool or process that easily allows people to go out and create brand new teams. And even, by the way, if you have a tool that lets you create brand new teams and has a workflow associated with it, you probably still want to have at least one or two paths through that whole decision tree process that just get approved by default. Somebody says, I just need an ad hoc team. I just need it for a short period of time, less than 3 months. We probably don't, and it's no external access or whatever. We don't need to then have that go to a manager and then go to a VP or even to IT and do an approval. That just slows things down. Let it be provisioned. Let them start working on it, because we want to make sure that all of those teams that we're creating are on a path to being deleted when they're no longer used, right? We want to make sure we get rid of them later on. So another big mistake that I've seen organizations do, and I'll be honest, right? Even inside of Quisitive, where I work, we've made this mistake as well. We're a technology company. Everybody knows technology. Everybody will know how to use Teams and when to use it and when not to use it. And the answer to that is no, it doesn't work that way. Now, it's okay to let people experiment, right? We want people to go out and experiment. We want them to try to solve their problems using Teams. And if it doesn't work, that's okay. We can always pivot and go a different direction. I tell people stories about how when we first started using Teams in my organization, we created a team to track all the sales pursuits, right? And that was great. But the problem was we created a channel for each individual pursuit, and pretty soon we hit the 250 channel limit, and we could never get rid of channels because I would go to the salesperson and say, is this opportunity dead? Can we delete it? And they're like, oh, no, there's still a chance, right? We might still win that. Even though somebody else got the contract, they might screw it up, so we don't want to do that. And we learned the lesson of having to actually redesign. We redesigned multiple times until we finally finalized on the architecture that we've worked going forward. Okay, and so don't roll Teams out without training people and with showing them how things can work and letting them know that it's okay to try and not succeed. We learn from our failures as well. And don't just assume the default values are right. They aren't, okay? Anonymous sharing enabled throughout your entire tenant is probably not what you want to have happen. So take a look at those settings, make sure you know what they are, document what they are before you make any changes, make your changes, and periodically check to make sure that Microsoft hasn't rolled out something that's added new features or has changed certain settings or changed what that setting means because of that, okay? So those are some lessons I've learned from the field. And at this point, I'm going to hand it back to everybody else.
I hope you can see my screen. Hi, let me show you SysKit Point. SysKit Point can help you do a lot of stuff that David was just talking about. This is our home screen. From here, you can access your data quite easily. So let's start. First things first, this is the sites overview screen. In here, you get the overview of all of your sites you have in your tenant, as well as some additional data, like sharing settings or metadata. And you get all of that in one place. And for your convenience, we have some built-in views that you can use. Let's say you can use externally shared sites to see what sites can be externally shared, how many external users do they have, and that is quite important, like David was talking about. When you're done reviewing your sites, you can also review your teams. In here, you can see how many members and owners they have and are they active or not. As before, you also have some built-in views that can help you discover stuff. The ones I would like to point out are teams with private channels and shared channels. Let's say for private channels, you can see what teams have private channels. Sometimes that is pretty hard to find. So in here, you get the overview of all of them and the number of how many private channels they actually have. And private channels can pose a security risk, like David was talking about, if they are not managed properly. So this can come in handy. Okay, when you're done with your teams and groups, you can also select the overview of your users. And in here, you also get some additional data, like the last time your users logged in, and are they internal or external users? And like before, you can use the built-in view to show off all of your external users. And here you can see if they're a guest or maybe an ad hoc guest. And for external users, Point can also help you get detailed overview of access across the tenant and all of their activities, such as viewing, deleting files or downloading files, or even sharing files with other people. And you really need to keep an eye on that, just like David said. Okay, these would be the overview screens. We also have a really powerful reporting functionality. So let me show you some of our reports. Let's say an active content report. This report will show you all of the inactive workspaces you have in your environment. And in here, you can do the actions on them. You can decide if you want to keep the workspaces, maybe archive them or delete them. Or even better, you can ask your owners to do that for you, because they should know better if the life cycle is over or not. By doing these actions, you can prevent the sprawl of your workspaces like you have heard before. Okay, so this was a Teams presentation. So let's show some team reports. Let's do Microsoft Teams with private channels. So on a single report, you can see all of the teams that have private channels, all of the private channels, and of course, all of the owners and members of those channels on a single screen. And you can do actions in here as well. So if you need to do some management, you can do it right from here. Okay, that would be the overview and some reporting. SysKit Point also offers you governance features, and it helps you support lifecycle management from beginning to end. So this would be the beginning, the provisioning. Your admins can set up templates that your users can later use to create new teams or other workspaces. In here, you can set up governance policies or security labels like David was talking about. So you can use these features here. Okay, let me show you how this looks for your users. Your users can actually use Point Teams app, and they can request new workspaces here. They can request workspaces based on the templates that your admins have provided. They just need to fill out the data that the admins wanted, and they will get, they can create new teams in here. Okay, let's get back to the admin view. Once the team is created, we need to do some management. So you can add policies to your created teams or to existing teams as well. By default, we offer access review policies, guest user expiration policies, minimum and maximum number of owners, or even orphaned resources policies. And if you are wondering, what's in it for me? Well, your end users are the ones who know best who's collaborating on what, for how long, and who should see the files they have. And with these policies, they can help you do that. Okay, let me show you an important policy like access reviews. Your owners will get a link to the site something that looks something like this. In here, you get some basic overview of the workspace that you are reviewing. And after that, you can start your review. First, you can review your members. So you can add them, you can remove them, you have a lot of actions, and you can do some other reports from here. After that, you can review all of your sharing on your workspace. That includes all of the links. You can do actions as well. And if you are more interested in external sharing, which you probably are, you can check just the stuff that is shared externally. In the end, you will get a small overview of all of the actions that you did, and you will get the ability to complete the review. Like David said, continuously reviewing stuff and who has access to what, including the external sharing, of course, can help you stay in control, and you need to do this month after month. So SysKit Point can help you with that as well. And once the lifecycle is over, your owners or your admins, depending on what you want, will get an inactive content task, and they will get a screen like this that will tell them that your workspace is inactive. After that, you get to choose if you want to keep, archive, or delete your workspace. Okay, let's just do a small summary. SysKit Point can help you with the entire lifecycle of your workspaces. You can create them based on the templates that you have provided. You can do regular maintenance by using policies that you can set up or create your own. And in the end, you can dispose of your workspaces or decide to keep them if you want. And you can do all of that in just a single tool, all in one place. So this was just a fragment of SysKit Point. There is a lot more features that you can see. And if these features sounded interesting to you, we do offer a free 21-day SaaS trial. So try it out and see for yourself. And that would be a quick demo. So Patrick, back to you. If we can hear you.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Zlatko, for the excellent presentation. Okay, so yeah, also I would like to thank David for his presentation as well. Just to remind everyone, so if you had any questions, you can still submit them for this now Q&A session. So don't be shy, just send us any questions that you might have throughout this this session. Right, so David, are you ready? I believe we just got a question, so
yes, I'm right here.
Check that together. Let's see. All right, so first question is from Christina, so I appreciate the question. Yeah, maybe also could be that for Zlatko. So Christina is asking if can you see the names of the owners and members per team? I'm not sure which part that
if you're talking about SysKit Point, yes, of course, you can see the names of all of the owners, emails, and you can drill to your users to see a lot more data about them. You don't need to stay on just the name.
Yeah, and what I showed from an out-of-the-box standpoint of just exporting that stuff is not going to give you that information. You could do it through a PowerShell, and you're really talking to the Azure AD object at that point in time. It is obviously a lot easier to use a tool to do that than it is to do it manually.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Again, yeah. So while we wait, perhaps additional questions that can come. A common question that we hear maybe now for Zlatko, if people could manage anonymous and external sharing in bulk at once and not side by side.
You can do it across sites. So in SysKit Point, you can select as many links as you want. You can add them, remove them, edit them, whatever your heart's desire. You don't need to keep restrained to just one site.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, a couple of questions just came in. Tony is asking if SysKit Point work with GCC tenants.
Yes, we are just working on that. So GCC tenants are supported, and they will be even better supported in the future, we hope.
All right. There is also a question from Tara. I believe this is also for SysKit Point. What criteria is being used to determine a site or team as inactive?
So we collect audit logs and a lot of other data. So there's a lot of stuff happening in the background. But the thing that you can do, you don't, by default, it's 30 days that you don't have any actions. But if you want, you can set it up to be less or more depending on your needs.
Thanks. All right, another question came in from Anna. So thanks again for the questions. So the question is, do we need to upload the list of sites every time the analysis is needed, or is SysKit connected to our Microsoft license?
So SysKit continuously scans your environment. So there is a small delay, of course. Nothing is right away with Microsoft. When you add new sites or whatever you add to your environment, we will scan it in, let's say, 24 hours.
Yeah, if you do it manually, as I was showing you in the video that I showed you, yeah, you'd have to reload it every time, whether you're doing it manually through exports or through PowerShell, and that can become a lot of work. So I like to show people the manual way so that you kind of see the value of the tool when it's there.
Okay, thank you, David. Thank you, Zlatko. All right. So for now, there are no more questions coming in. Perhaps wait one additional minute, and in the meantime, David, anything you want to add before we finish this session?
You know, I think what I would tell people is it's never too late to start, you know, bringing some chaos, bringing some order out of the chaos, right? So I think it's important to recognize that you know, no matter how bad you think things are, somebody's probably done it worse, okay, in certain ways, and you're never gonna, you know, you're never gonna get it the way you want it to be without putting some effort into it. And so it's start now. Don't delay anymore, and just take it in bite-sized chunks, and you'll get there. And it's never quite done, right? Because there's always new stuff happening. That's the last piece of it. But thank you very much for the opportunity to come out and talk to you guys today.
Sure. Thank you very much, David. And thanks, Zlatko. All right, so once again, thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. As mentioned, everyone who registered for this event will receive a recording of the webinar. Again, thank you, David, and for joining us and giving this great presentation. It was a pleasure having you with us. And if anyone have any further questions regarding SysKit Point or any of our products, please reach out to us at sales@syskit.com. It was a pleasure having you all here, and see you next time.
Thank you.